for a global audience. And we have none other than Professor Dr. Victoria Harrison from the University of Macau. Good afternoon, Dr. Harrison.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Um,
Anytime you're ready, ma'am.
hmm, Let me just try to share my screen. Hmm. Do I have sharing permission already?
Alvin, paki-check. Mag-share si Dr. Harrison.
Hmm.
How was your flight, ma'am? Everything okay? Did you have a good
Yes,
flight?
it
Okay.
was very uneventful, really.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good to hear. Can you try your screen share again? Let's see if that was the problem was addressed.
Let me try again. Okay. Hmm. Okay. I think maybe this will now work.
Yeah, okay. We can see it now. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. And please forgive me. It's a long time since I've used Zoom, and now I'm trying to make it so that I can see the screen as well.
Okay.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so apologies for that. Hopefully, you're now all able to hear me and to see the slideshow which I have prepared. So, as advertised, my topic is philosophical research writing for a global audience. And I stand humbled after so many rich talks. I feel that to a very large extent, what I'm going to be saying is um, things that have already been said by others. But perhaps what I will do is put them into a more practical perspective. So, first of all, to give you a little bit of context about why I'm here giving this talk, I'm a British philosopher. I've held academic positions in the UK, in the United States, and the recent one, the current one, is at the University of Macau. And relevant to our topic here, I moved to Macau from the UK because I wanted to find a wider range of conversation partners for my work. And in this, I succeeded. And the evidence is that here I am talking with all of you. So, aside from that, I currently occupy several positions simultaneously, and all of these are relevant to what I want to talk to you about today. As a philosopher, I'm an author. I'm also a referee of other people's papers. I'm the editor of a Q1 philosophy journal. I'm a mentor And I'm also a philosopher who works across different cultural traditions. And I can add that I've also done my time as a senior university administrator. And one of the tasks that I was given to do was to invigorate the research culture in my Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of Macau. So the lecture which I've prepared for you is built out of this wide range of experience. So I really hope that some of it will be useful. So here's the challenge as I currently understand it. We need to know how we can write philosophy that readers anywhere in the world can understand and value. And how can we do that without simply writing just like everybody else? How can we create our own style and write something genuinely interesting? I want to emphasize that international publishing isn't primarily about writing on Western philosophy. I think that that's already quite evident from many of the talks today. I'd also add to that that it's not about abandoning your own research questions in an effort to reach an international audience. I think that's a temptation that many young researchers fall into. But I want to try to demonstrate that it's really not necessary to give in to that. It's also not necessary to attempt to imitate scholars who are already successful in your efforts to publish internationally. The lecture is going to try to give you some tips about how you can avoid all of these pitfalls, and positively, how you can learn to think about communicating your genuine philosophical contribution clearly to readers from different backgrounds. The lecture is organized around different perspectives. As you'll see later, the editorial perspective is going to be quite prominent in what I'm going to say. But I think it's important to start out thinking about your audience, because writing for a global audience, whatever this means, begins with understanding who your likely readers are. So here's our question. Who do you expect to read your paper? This is maybe not the first question in your mind when you're thinking about writing a paper, but I want to suggest to you that it's a really important question to really think about explicitly before you actually start writing. And I know that might be difficult sometimes when you feel the pressure to write a paper, but just spending a little time thinking about who you're writing the paper for, who your readers are going to be, is a really useful practical exercise. And in terms of international publishing, it's worth remembering that there really isn't any such thing as a global audience. It's a term that we use when we talk about international research, international publishing, but really there are many audiences, and it's worth just keeping them distinct in your own minds. So maybe you will write for specialists in your own field, whatever that field is. Or maybe you want to write a paper that's primarily for philosophers working in a different field, maybe We sometimes call these generalist papers. Perhaps you want to write a paper that will be accessible to philosophers working in other traditions, or even scholars from neighboring disciplines who aren't necessarily trained in philosophy at all. Journal editors and reviewers also count as your audience. And I suspect that many people don't really think about this latter category as carefully as they could. And I will say more about that category later on. But for now, the thing to notice is that each of these audiences is going to possess a different kind of background knowledge and is going to be asking different questions when they read your paper. So you need to think about what changes between these different audiences and learn how to craft a paper that's explicitly targeted for an audience. And it's not really a question of changing your core argument. We're all philosophers here, or I presume that most of us are. And we know that the argument is the core thing of what we do in philosophy. We create our arguments. This is our core intellectual work. So we don't want to change that just to appeal to an audience. But the good news is that usually we don't have to. All we need to do is think about adjusting the way we present our ideas, our explanations, our assumptions, the examples that we use, the amount of background that we give, and also the range of literature that we discuss in our paper. So all of these can make a big, big difference to how accessible your research becomes to these different audiences in an international context. So think of philosophical writing as a craft. It's an essential skill that all philosophers really need to learn and to practice because it's the key medium by which we communicate our ideas. And the key piece of that is anticipation about what the audience, what the reader will need to know in order to understand our thought. So writing for a global audience, thus qualified, in an international publishing venue, really requires some fairly obvious things, obvious from the perspective of someone trained in philosophy. We need to define our concepts carefully. I think this goes without saying. We need to motivate rather than merely assume claims that would be controversial outside the usual range of our own conversation partners. We need to acknowledge alternative positions. If we expect people to give our paper a reading when they don't already agree with the kind of position that we are adopting, we need to distinguish our assertions from our arguments in a very clear, delineated kind of way. And by all of this, we're making our disagreements intellectually productive. Every paper is putting forward some point of view, some line of argument, and inevitably, there will be readers who don't agree with it. But if you've written the paper well, this shouldn't actually matter because the disagreement itself can become productive if it's presented to your readership in an engaging, interesting, lucid way. So I urge everyone just to remember that there isn't really anything super special about a global audience. It's just an audience that's more diverse than a local one. And by local, I mean that group of people who are your usual conversation partners as philosophers. So I want to suggest then that clarity is actually more than a philosophical virtue. It's actually an essential feature of a successful paper. And as philosophers, I think clarity is really, it's almost the essence of what we try to achieve in our own thinking. And the trick of philosophical writing is learning how to infuse that writing with the kind of clarity we hope to have in our own thought. So, what's the goal of international philosophical writing, writing for an international audience? I suggest that it's not really to become an international philosopher, but rather it's to think of yourself as trying to make an original philosophical contribution and one that readers anywhere can appreciate and understand. So setting the goal in this more positive, more achievable way can make a big difference to how easily you can reach that goal. Because it can sound very grand and very out of reach, this goal to become an international philosopher. So just try reframing and put it in terms of an original philosophical contribution that your readers anywhere can understand. So it's an early career workshop, and I thought it would be quite useful to just get a few common mistakes out of the way before going forward. The first mistake that I see people making over and over again as an editor and also as a mentor is that they begin with a topic, maybe a really, really interesting topic, really important, but it's not a philosophical problem or philosophical question. And people stumble trying to make that transition from topic to question. I will say more about that later in the paper, or later in the talk. Second common mistake is assuming readers share the necessary background. And very often the form that that takes is you write philosophy as if you're essentially writing for yourself. And the result is something that only you can read. And I say, well, you, but of course, sometimes I fall into this trap as well. All of us can. So just take care when you're writing for a reader that you're writing something that that reader can actually understand without actually being you. The third thing is that thinking originality requires an entirely new topic. And again, in my mentoring and editorial experience, I see people doing this all the time, very frequently. They're trying to make a mark or come to attention in philosophy by thinking of something entirely new. And that's really difficult to do. But the good news is it's not actually necessary. And it's certainly not necessary if you just want to publish work that will be read internationally. And the next slide looks at this a bit more closely. So, what is originality in philosophy? I'm often asked this question. There are many forms in which originality can come, I think. And one of these is asking familiar questions in a new way. I'm sure that you can all think of your own examples of this, but the one that comes to my mind is Thomas Nagel, What's It Like to Be a Bat? Virtually everyone knows that paper or has heard of it. And its originality was taking a very old question, but putting it to the reader in an entirely new way. Another form that philosophical originality takes is bringing neglected material into an established debate. So, for example, Miranda Fricker's work on epistemic injustice, that brought new material into established debates within epistemology. So this was original and sparked off whole new research programs. Another form of originality is connecting two conversations that rarely, if ever, interact. And again, probably you can think of your own examples, but the one that stands out for me is L.A. Paul's work on transformative experience that brought together philosophy of decision making with philosophy of personal identity. And the originality of that work has had a huge impact on philosophical discussions worldwide. You can also think of originality as challenging an assumption that others have taken for granted. And here, I think Gettier's paper, um, what was the name of it? Is justified true belief knowledge? This is a really classic example of this style of originality. Take an assumption that virtually everyone just takes for granted and show how it can be questioned. Final form I just want to mention is simply offering a clearer or more persuasive argument for a topic that's already under discussion. And I leave all of you to just think of your own examples of that one. I think there are plenty of them out there. But the point of doing this catalogue of philosophical originality is to try to encourage all of you early career scholars, not to worry about introducing a completely new topic into philosophical discussion, but rather think about these other kinds of ways in which you can make an original contribution to what's an existing philosophical problem. That's a much easier approach, a much easier entry point into philosophical discussions. Pick something that people are already talking about. So, coming now to part two of the talk, thinking like an editor. And this is the part of the talk that I like best because I can really speak from my own direct experience here as an editor. I'm going to answer a number of questions that probably you have about the process. Maybe you haven't articulated them yet, but I'm going to be talking from an editor's point of view because it's probably one that many of you haven't really considered before. But it's actually quite helpful if you're in the position of trying to find venues to publish your work. It's a common myth that editors are looking for reasons to reject papers. I want to assure you that actually the opposite is true. The job of an editor is to find papers, to find good papers that will really make worthwhile contributions to the journal that they're responsible for. So editors are actually on the lookout actively for papers that deserve publication. This means that editors have a baseline of receptivity to new papers that come in. The downside of that, of course, is that for the top international journals, the Q1 journals, a lot of papers come in, and editors have limited amount of time and limited amount of patience. I want in the next part of the talk, to try to explain to you how you can make your papers more immediately appealing to the editor. So what happens when you click the submit button, submit a paper for review? Probably for you, that's the end of the story, but for the editor, that's the beginning. The first thing that will happen is the editor reads the abstract. The abstract is that crucial piece of work that so many philosophers completely neglect to pay attention to. Often they write the paper, they get everything exactly as they want it, and then they realize, oh no, I need an abstract to submit. And they cobble something together and off it goes. But this is actually the first thing that the editor reads. And if the abstract is promising, then it sets the tone. It provides the frame through which the editor will go on to the next step, which is deciding whether the paper fits the journal. If the editor decides to go ahead, that the paper does fit the journal, the editor chooses external reviewers. And again, this is often based on what was in that abstract. And the reviewers eventually write up their reports, and the editorial decision is made. But the key thing in all of this really is that little abstract, the thing that provides the first impression. So I want to talk about that a bit more. It's often the most important paragraph in the paper, and it's one that requires a particular kind of philosophical skill to write. And it's a skill that even seasoned philosophers, people who've been doing it for a long time, often haven't paid attention to. And many people don't realize that the purpose of the abstract isn't just to describe the topic, but it's got to do something much more precise to be effective. You are telling the editor what philosophical question your paper is addressing. You're telling the editor why it's important, why the editor should think about publishing this in their journal. You're telling the editor what the paper argues and what its contribution is. And you're telling the editor how does it make that contribution. Now, I put that in terms of telling the editor because the editor is your first reader. The second readers will be the reviewers who will also look at the abstract to try to answer these questions. You need to tell your first readers exactly why your paper deserves their attention. Now, I've gotten an example here of a weak abstract, ineffective, in other words, because so many people do it like this that it's really worth highlighting. In case some of you can't see the screen, I'll just quickly read this. This paper discusses the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. It examines recent developments in AI technology and considers a number of ethical issues raised by its increasing use in society. The paper surveys different positions in the literature before offering some reflections on the future development of AI. That is the kind of abstract that many people write. But from an editorial point of view, it is almost completely ineffective. It tells an editor what the topic is, the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. But the editor isn't told, well, which ethical issue? There are so many things that this could actually be about. What's the argument? No clue is given in this abstract. But most importantly, the abstract doesn't say what's new about this paper. What's the contribution? So an abstract like this really is much more like a description of a piece of work a student might write for a survey course. It's not yet a persuasive philosophical abstract. On the next slide, I want to show you a stronger version or a more effective rendition. So again, I will read this one out. Recent discussions of artificial intelligence often assume that moral responsibility lies either with designers or with users. This paper argues that this dichotomy overlooks an important category of distributed responsibility arising from human AI collaboration. By analyzing several influential accounts of moral agency, I show that existing models fail to capture shared responsibility in hybrid decision-making systems. The paper proposes a revised account that clarifies responsibility in contexts involving increasingly autonomous technologies. So I hope you can all see why this abstract is going to be much more effective than the one that we previously looked at. If an editor reads this abstract, they're probably going to get a bit excited. It's very clear. It's absolutely clear what the argument is going to be, what the paper is going to do, where the contribution is coming. Even if the editor has no personal interest at all in this topic, they would be able to see why this might matter in the philosophical conversation. So, what does the editor do next? After forming a first impression, let's say they get this very strong abstract, the editor then feels quite positive. Maybe there's a good paper here that I can get for my journal. So the editor then begins to actually read the paper. But then these questions are going to come up again because the abstract is one thing, but then the paper itself is another. So through the initial reading, the editor wants to make sure that the philosophical question remains clear, the contribution remains clear. They want to be assured that the conversation the paper is engaging in is actually a conversation that's going on. It's not something that's just in the head of the person who's writing. They want to be assured that the author is familiar with and understands the literature, and also that the paper is likely to interest the journal's readership. So that last point is an assessment the editor makes about the suitability of a paper for a particular journal. The thing that I want to really emphasize about this is that these are all questions about philosophical clarity and philosophical contribution. They're not questions about whether or not the argument succeeds or whether or not the editor thinks the argument succeeds. That's really a secondary issue. The key issues are clarity and clear contribution. And I'm stressing this because I think these are points that are often overlooked by, especially by early career researchers who are they're under a lot of pressure just to get their work out there into the public domain. They don't often have time to think through exactly how what they're submitting is received. After the editors look through the abstract and they begin the reading, obviously the next thing that comes up for them is the introduction. This is usually just first few paragraphs of the paper. And the editor wants to make sure that 5 tasks are covered in this introduction. And the editor is checking this because they have to make sure that they're not publishing work that is going to be difficult for their readers to actually read. That's the editor's job. So they ask themselves, does the introduction explain the problem? Does it explain the importance of the problem? The gap that's being filled, the contribution that's being made? And does it provide this thing called the roadmap of the argumentation of the paper? It's just basic anatomical stuff, the things which you expect an introduction to contain. And you might think, well, wow, this is so elementary. But you would be very surprised about how many papers fail on this point. They don't pass editorial review because the editor thinks, well, I just can't send that out to review. It's not clear enough what it's doing. And the editor is conscious that it's difficult to get reviewers. And if you keep sending them things that are not really good enough to read, not ready to read, they're going to stop reviewing. So this is why you've got to be sure that your paper's absolutely ready to be read before you submit. So why do papers fail? Well, usually it's because of the kind of things that I've already talked about. It's not because of the ideas, or not usually because of the arguments, but because the paper doesn't make clear what it's trying to achieve, what it's trying to contribute to the discussion. So maybe the philosophical question is unclear. Maybe what the paper is trying to contribute to the discussion is unclear. These might be because of poor organization. It might be because the paper seems to spring out of nowhere with no engagement with existing literature. So the editor, or the reviewers, if it gets that far, can't give it a context in ongoing discussions. Or it may be that the conclusion just doesn't really match what the argument establishes. But all of those things can be addressed by revision. What I want to, in self-defense partly, urge upon you is the idea that you can do that yourself before even sending anything out for an editor to look at. Just try to adopt an editor's perspective, or if you can't do it yourself, then invite a colleague or one of your peers to try to do that for you. Identify these problems to save everybody a lot of difficulty after the submission takes place. Going on to part 3, I said earlier that one of the mistakes or pitfalls that early career researchers often fall into is not managing to effectively make the transition from a topic to a philosophical contribution. And I want to demonstrate how this can be done in this part of the talk with a very brief case study, which I will get to in a few slides. But be aware, moving into this part of the talk, that every journal article can be thought of as part of an ongoing philosophical discussion. I've used the word conversation and also the word discussion quite a lot so far in this talk because I think it's very important to emphasize when you're trying to publish your work, trying to find an audience on an international stage, you need to be thinking about what conversations you want to join with that paper. What do you want to do with that paper? Where do you want it to go? And as I said earlier, readers, the editor, the reviewers, and the wider readers, they want to know that too. If they know what conversation you're trying to join, then that gives them clues about why they should care, why they should put their time into reading your paper. And they will know in advance what kind of contribution you're trying to make, so they can judge whether or not they want to read it. So think of yourself as trying to get answers to these questions into the minds of your readers as quickly and as unambiguously as possible. And that's again where clarity becomes essential. Every successful philosophical paper makes this move that I've been talking about from topic to philosophical question. And I think that we can identify a general principle here, which is that the topic supplies the material but the philosophical question supplies the contribution. So you've got to have both, and you've got to figure out how to put them together effectively to create a successful paper. Now, here's the case study. And here's where I'm going to be kind of embarrassed because I had hoped by this point to have spent a whole day talking to people who would have taught me how to pronounce this word. Um, but that has not happened. So my case study is on the concept of Bayunihun, Bayunihun. Now, that's my best approximation. I'm happy to be corrected about this later. So, let's suppose your research begins with Bayunihun. This is your topic. And you have a sense that there's something philosophically interesting here, but so far, all you have is the instinct. I want to write a paper on Bayunihun. The question to ask yourself is this one. Is Bayunihun the philosophical question? Is it a philosophical question at all? And the answer that I expect that you'll come up with is, well, no, it's not. So how do we get a philosophical question out of this wonderfully interesting concept? Well, I did a brainstorm about this myself to see how I would do it, just to demonstrate it for you. And I found five really interesting philosophical questions that come directly out of this topic, now this concept. So instead of trying to just write generally about Bayunihun, you could focus on a question like, well, what is solidarity? Or what makes a community more than a collection of individuals? What motivates cooperation? What virtues sustain communal life? How should we understand mutual obligation? That's five questions, all really solid philosophical questions, each of which could be the topic of a paper, but all linked to this concept. Now, let's say that you wanted to go with one of these ideas. How would you frame an introduction to invite your audience into this way of thinking, into this investigation? Well, your introduction in version 1 might start, this paper discusses the concept of bayunihan in Philippine culture. Okay, well, so far so good. That sentence does tell the reader what the paper is about, but you'll know from our earlier discussion of abstracts and introductions, it doesn't tell us why the paper matters philosophically. Now look at version 2. Contemporary debates about solidarity often assume a tension between individual autonomy and collective obligation. This paper argues that the practice of Bayunihun offers an alternative model of communal cooperation that can enrich contemporary discussions in social and political philosophy. Now, that second version is so much more interesting than the first version because it does what the first version does. It tells us what the topic is, what the paper is about. But before it does that, it's locating the discussion in something more general. And then it's immediately telling the reader how Bayunihun can offer us a new way of thinking about these issues that are already embedded in contemporary discussions in key areas of philosophy. So immediately you're drawing your topic of interest into a discussion that's already taking place. And your paper falls out of that. And your reader is able to understand immediately why this might matter to things that they actually care about anyway. So much depends here on the framing of your idea and the presentation to your audience. So I think you can all see why that version 2 is stronger. It's immediately answering those central three questions. What conversation is the paper joining? What is the contribution? And why should someone outside the Philippines care? Why is this more than just a local concern? And that's exactly the kind of information that the editor that first reads your abstract wants to know. Uh, the reviewers are looking for it. And then if it passes those stages, this is what the readers want to know too. Now, I used a local example there to illustrate how to move from topic to actual philosophical contribution. But the general point is the same no matter what topic you're interested in. Maybe it's Filipino philosophy, maybe it's Kant or Buddhist ethics, philosophy of mind, AI or philosophy of science. It could be anything. But whatever it is, the task is the same. You need to answer that question: what philosophical problem does the material help us understand? The underlying principle is always unchanged. And I want to emphasize again that the point I made isn't about comparative philosophy. I'm not suggesting that to be successful on the international publishing stage, every paper should somehow integrate a local tradition, a concept from a local tradition with a debate in Western philosophy. It's not that at all. And nor is it that every paper should begin with culturally distinctive material. It's really not necessary. The point is really quite simple. It's just that every paper has to identify its question and identify the debate to which the material is contributing. That's really all you have to do. Make sure that the readers can immediately understand why they might want to read your paper. Now, um, part 4, and I'm conscious of the time, but I think this part's really important too, building an international research identity, how to think beyond your next paper. All right, there's so much pressure that all of us are under now to just keep publishing as much as we can, as often as we can. And it's worth stepping back from that and thinking in terms of more than one paper. Publishing internationally isn't just a one-off success, but you might find it more rewarding if you think in terms of becoming an internationally recognized scholar. And the way that you do that is by developing your own research program, thinking about philosophical questions that recur in your own work, and developing recognizable areas of expertise through an accumulation of papers dealing with related issues. So instead of publishing on many, many different things, as you're strategically developing your career, think about clusters of papers that are going to reinforce a reputation for expertise in a particular area. And if you do that, then editors and also readers will begin to associate your name with particular conversations. And as your career progresses, you'll find that you start to get invitations to write on these topics. So it's true that most successful careers are built one paper at a time, but they have a general intellectual direction. So develop your research program. Think about which questions return, but also be aware of what you're genuinely interested in. Try not to get drawn too far away from what your actual interests are in your effort to publish as much as you can. Because in the long run, it's difficult to sustain long-term engagement with your own work if that happens. And this might seem outrageous, but I would say this to early career scholars. Think about the next 10 years. What do you want to achieve in those 10 years with your publishing plans? What conversations do you want to be part of? Be ambitious. As we heard earlier today, there are really no limits to what we can achieve philosophically, but it needs planning. Don't leave things to accidental connections. Ask yourself how the thing that you're working on now connects with the thing that you will be working on next to build up this coherent body of research that will stand behind your reputation. So, long-term planning, build this reputation gradually. Try to resist the pressure to publish things before they're ready. Keep your work up to a good standard and put the time into finding appropriate journals. There are lots of mentors out there who can advise you about that. I'd also recommend presenting research at conferences as often as you can, just getting feedback on audiences before your work gets into fully written form and goes off to editors and readers. Yeah, so grow your reputation through these different forums. And I'm drawing to a close now, but I just wanted to share some really practical advice here, things that I have found helpful. We don't always have time to write up all the ideas that occur to us. Things come up while we're teaching, while we're talking to colleagues. Just write things down immediately and put them in a file, store them away somewhere for when you've got time to work on them. And if you have a spare moment later on, time to write, pick up one of these papers, see if you can rework the idea. If you've got unfinished work, find opportunities to present it as often as you can to get as much feedback as possible before you actually commit to writing a full draft. The more feedback, the better. And again, this is self-defense as an editor. Revise patiently and diligently. Do your revision before submitting, choose your journals carefully, it saves a lot of time, and read as much as you can. Don't stop reading because of the pressure to write. And finally, don't be afraid of rejection. It really does happen to everyone. Every philosopher has surely accumulated uh, a stack of rejection letters. It just happens, and it's not the end of the world. Doesn't mean that your work's not good. It may well mean that you just sent it to the wrong place or you sent it before it was quite ready. But these things happen. Yeah. Um, I've talked about career advancement and publishing, but I think you can also just keep in mind that publishing is an invitation to participate in a worldwide community of scholarship. And that's just such a rewarding, exciting thing. It's a wonderful opportunity, and it's worth creating the best writing that you can to fully participate in this community. And you want your writing to be something that also welcomes others into the world of thought that you occupy by explaining its concepts and doing the things that philosophers do, making understanding easy and your ideas engaging and welcoming. So, final reflections. The internationalization of philosophy, it doesn't require philosophers everywhere to become more alike. I haven't said very much about this, but it's the underlying thread of what I've been talking about. Develop your distinctive voice. There's no need to imitate others in the style that you are philosophizing in. Just become better at explaining why your own work and why your own questions should matter to other people. And crucially, don't think of yourself as just a consumer of philosophy, international philosophy, but think of yourselves right from the start as a potential contributor to an international philosophical discussion. And remember that the future of philosophy will not be shaped only by our questions, the things that we ask ourselves that interest us, but it will also be shaped by our ability to explain why those questions matter to other people. So the writing is not an accidental extra, but it's essential to what we do as philosophers. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you might have and to talking with you in person tomorrow, hopefully, and maybe this evening.